Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Real Training for Free. Microsoft MVP Nick Cavalancia sitting in here for Randy Franklin Smith. We're glad that you joined us today. This is a kind of an interesting take on a previous webinar. If we normally don't have this, we talk about the same topic twice, but there was enough material here that really felt like it was worth revisiting this topic. Back in November, we talked about the idea of an identity attack surface. And the good folks at Silverfort that are sponsoring today's webcast did a presentation on talking about some very specific ways that that identity is actually weak. And yeah, that's simple things like your passwords are weak, but it's not what we're talking about. It's things that go beyond that. And then we were having this conversation about a month ago talking about some of the changes that have occurred where we're actually able to really see a shift where we're having a lateral movement that moves across a hybrid environment. So shifting, in this case, we're going to use some examples of on-prem to cloud. And so really thought it was worthwhile having this again. And there will be probably a little bit of overlap. If you went and sat in the last one, you'll get to see a nice little refresher. But there's definitely some new content in this webcast today, so please don't feel like we're just showing you the same thing twice, because that's definitely not the case here. We're definitely going to be doing some things that are a little bit different, trying to show you specifically in some areas where we've added on, augmented the conversation about shifting in that lateral movement from on-prem to cloud. Now, I did mention that today's webcast, is made possible, of course, by Silverfort. They are the ones that did the last one as well. And joining me today is their VP of Product Marketing, Yiftach Keshet. Yiftach, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure is all mine.
Yep, Yiftach and I have done a couple of these together, so it's always fun to do these. A couple of bit of housekeeping items before we get started into the content today. We are recording today's webcast, so you will be receiving a link to the recording after the webcast, usually a day or two afterwards, so you can be on the look for that in case you have to drop off early or you want to share this with a colleague, et cetera, et cetera. Also, for questions, we do have a Q&A box that I'm going to have open here. So in the GoToWebinar control panel that you've got, you'll have a place where you can stick in questions there. As we're doing these, the webcast, the presentation today, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, anecdotes, jokes, I don't know, whatever you feel like telling us, we'll certainly take it in there. And we want to try to include those in contextually throughout the webcast today. So rather than, we will of course have formal time at the end of today's webcast for doing Q&A, but a lot of times some of the questions come in like, how did you detect that? And if that's the question, it's kind of hard to answer that question like 35 minutes later, right? So we try to make sure that there's an opportunity to answer those questions during the webcast while we're doing the presenting, to kind of include you in on the conversation that we're having and the presentation that's being made. So I've got this Q&A box up here in front of me. I will be monitoring that like crazy. We'll try to make sure we answer those questions, address those comments, let you interject some thoughts, whatever it is that you happen to have throughout the webcast today. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and take a first go at this and talk about a couple of different aspects of this, sort of laying things up for Yiftach to do his presentation at the end here. And I want to talk about, first off, why identities are constantly seen as being this primary attack surface within cyber attacks of just about any kind. And then we'll talk a little bit about how does basically every threat action trace back to a weak identity attack surface. That's going to be a bit of a review from even the last webinar we did back in November, just one slide, but I do want to touch on that again to make sure that we level set with everyone here. And then we want to talk a little bit about what does hybrid lateral movement look like these days. And Yiftach, as I'm going through this, if you have a comment, please by all means jump in and so on. I might even throw a question your way. So just know that those are coming, or feel free to join in and we have a little bit of a back and forth dialogue. Does that sound good?
Definitely.
Excellent, excellent. So the first question here is even just why attack identity, and some of this is just really super obvious stuff, but I just want to make sure that we're talking through this a little bit here and making sure that in case there's somebody who maybe is new to cybersecurity, you're definitely getting level set. But for everyone else, we're just sort of setting the context of why we're just so laser focused on identity being the focus for a lot of these attacks. Now, obviously, we're not talking about the initial focus. The initial focus is getting a foothold in an organization. That's usually through vulnerabilities, or they're trying to utilize some malware that gets downloaded by a user through a phishing attack, or maybe it's an RDP type of brute force attack, et cetera, et cetera. That's the initial attack vector, but why is identity always under attack? And so as it just makes sense to all of us, you got to have privilege. You've got to have some standing level of privilege, whether that's just privilege to log on to a local workstation to establish persistence, still relies having some kind of privilege on that machine, and therefore you need to have identity to do so. Or, of course, when we start to do things like wanting to laterally move and so on, but I'll talk about that in a second here. And if you think about it, there's really only one of two ways that you're going to gain privilege on a system. We could have a little bit of a dialogue back and forth, even though these are in the audience. There might be a couple of exceptions to this rule, but in general, it's either you're going to gain privilege on an endpoint or on a system through vulnerability exploits, meaning you've already got a service, an application, something that already has privilege, and you're utilizing some methodology, an SQL injection for the sake of conversation, let's say, just to go ahead and gain access to that privilege and have unfettered access to that system, or it's credentials. It's one of the two, basically. There may be a couple of exceptions here, but in generally, that's the only two ways you're going to gain privilege in an environment here. And when you think about it, one is certainly a lot more easy to do so than the other. You take vulnerabilities, we need to either have a system that is ripe and hasn't been patched in forever and still has a vulnerability from 6 months ago, a year ago. There are still some cases systems that are being compromised from vulnerabilities that have been here for years and years, over a decade, and that sort of thing. And the but in the other case, if you have got an attacker that's trying to gain access a very specific way, it means they're going to need like a 0-day attack of some kind, more than likely, so they can gain the access they need through a much larger number of potential victims. Otherwise, you're obviously restricted down to only those environments that don't have that particular vulnerability patched. And then in the case of credentials, I mean, there's some really good examples, actually, even just of the vulnerability exploits. There was one from Microsoft last year as an example where they were in Azure. And so just talking about this idea, since we're revolving this around the idea of hybrid lateral movement, there were 4 Azure services where there was able to do server-side request forgeries. And so that's a vulnerability exploit, but you'd have to know which services and be able to take advantage of them. And then what do you do once you have the server-side request forgery accomplished? And then what can you do with it? And can you actually then laterally move, or can you give yourself access to an account or whatever? That sort of thing. But obtaining credentials is far easier. Last year, there were a couple reports that talked about the number one goal of phishing attacks was to just gather credentials. As a matter of fact, there was a report that I wrote about last year where a cybersecurity vendor named Netscope wrote this article about they were monitoring Cloudflare R2 instances, basically storage on the web. You could build bogus websites and do impersonation of different websites and whatnot for harvesting credentials. And they had this 61x spike. So you're talking 6,100. No, is that right? 100%, 61,000% increase. Did I get that right? I don't know. 61 times. You guys do the math. I can't do the math right now while I'm talking. But a 61x spike in Microsoft credential campaigns in just a 6-month time frame. So there's just a massive uptick in realizing, hey, if we just go get these credentials in Microsoft 365, there's a good chance they might be viable on-prem as well, or we can leverage them to gain access to Azure AD. They might actually have elevated credentials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lot easier just to go after credentials than to go after vulnerabilities. And then at the same time, think about just the number of tools that exist for gathering credentials on, let's say, an endpoint. We've talked about tools like Mimikatz or Lasagna, just as an example, for scraping RAM, and tools for taking advantage of a privilege on a system. There's lots more methods and tools that are available for doing credential-related attacking than there are for a vulnerability exploit, because that's going to be one tool for one exploit, so to speak. That's not exactly accurate, but go with the idea here. And then the last thing here is that realistically, only one's really going to truly facilitate the lateral movement necessary, where I need to go to another system. Yes, it's possible to then to utilize, let's say, I was going to say, if you're going to leverage like a backup credential, backup service account that has access to multiple systems, that would probably facilitate lateral movement. But if you're trying to move from system to system and gain access to an actual, what am I saying? Like I was going to say Explorer interface. It's not Explorer anymore. But anyways, an actual, as if you're on premise on that machine, you're going to need to have some kind of credentials to do so. I mean, you've talked, this isn't a comprehensive list by any means, but any other reasons why you see identity as kind of being the focus here?
Well, I think first of all, I want to relate back to the first point that you brought up. In this, it's like here we have a bulleted list. The first item is vulnerability exploits. Second is credentials. Now, it doesn't. And you said, I just want to re-emphasize. There's credentials are a million times more available than vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerability, I came from endpoint security, from exploits, from memory corruption. It's like discovering a vulnerability. It's a dark art, right? When a new 0-day comes up, it's a festival. Now, credentials, on the other hand, they're just out there. I think in one of the security events that I've attended, I think it was 3-4 years ago, there was a session that started from this iconic movie Hackers, I think from 1998 to 1997, with Angelina Jolie.
Yep.
Okay, and it starts with the CISO or whatever, calling out the person, everyone, that their password is password, right? And it literally, it haven't changed. I can tell you, even myself, I work in a cybersecurity company that focuses on identity. Okay, I go through identity threats and identity attacks every day. Well, I'll tell you, I have one very good password that I can memorize. Okay, and I'm still using it across the web for literally every website that needs login. It's like, I think by definition, credentials are just out there, and we'll see that soon when I get into my slides. It's not even the passwords are out there, but the weaknesses that enable the bad guys to figure out these credentials. I've just seen in one of the recent researches, there are more than 24 billion compromised credentials, okay, out there, to sell in the dark web. Like, contemplate on this figure for a minute, like 24 billion. I mean, I don't know. I assume if you type all these passwords and you just put them, one next to the other, I mean, I think it's like 10 times to the moon and back. It's such a low hanging fruit, and plus, as you actually said, once you're inside, once you've gained the initial access, you have landed on an endpoint, you're there. This is literally the only way you can spread. Once every 10 years, you have this sort of blue keep or eternal blue vulnerabilities that enable you. That's what happened with WannaCry. Okay, so like 7 years ago, we had this vulnerability that enabled ransomware actors to spread within the network through SMB without authentication. Okay, but this is not once in a lifetime, but it's once in a decade. The mainstream to do that is with credentials.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense here. There's an attack. Alan, even in the audience, asked, we talk about it, a Microsoft attack that happened. They disclosed earlier last month, where a threat actor named Midnight Blizzard actually started with a password spray attack, wanted to try and access a sort of a non-production test account, but then escalated privileges through using OAuth and accessed a bunch of corporate email accounts, and some of them even belong to senior leadership. It sounds like, the escalation there, if it's just OAuth, providing access, there must have been some real trust to this tenant account for whatever reason. But
I'll tell you. By the way,
yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think it's quite ingenious. So it was a test tenant account, right? Like Microsoft enables you, if you're not sure that you wanna set up or to increase the size of your Outlook, of your Office 365 tenant, you can set up a test tenant. Okay. Now, point is, who are the people, who are the personnel that set up such a test tenant? They are IT admins, right? I mean, they're the people that manage everything. Of course, they're the ones that have the best credentials. And you know, from my encounters with these people, they set up this test tenant. They probably have this either either use their own password, okay, or they have a password they set up exactly for that. But the point is that even though it's a test tenant, it is set up by the people with the most powerful credentials in the company. Right. I mean, I mean, it was when I've seen that, I said, wow, this is a real stroke of genius from the attacker side, because even though it's just a tenant, you know, it's actually an amazing. It's like the most powerful person in the company sort of left an open window for you to jump inside.
That makes perfect sense, and that's all that it takes. It just takes that one, foothold in there, and then these guys have a whole playbook of how they're going to try and gain access beyond that. And you're right, they're brilliant. It's they used to be years ago, before we had all of this, the cybercrime economy, the really a sharing of ideas and methodologies and whatnot. I used to just go out to folks and say, Microsoft has this 288-page security guide, tells you how to harden everything, Active Directory, Windows servers, desktops. And I would usually ask a crowd, like, how many of you have read that? And normally it's like no hands, maybe like one hand. I go, who's read that? All the cyber attackers, because they're figuring out basically it's a toolkit of where you all are insecure. And so that's why this topic today is just, I think, so really important here. I wanted to show, this is a slide that I had from the original version of today's webinar back in November. And I just want to spend like 30 seconds on this, because I just want to make sure everybody knows this, and I don't want to spend too much time because it is just a duplicative slide. And over on the left is the credential access portion of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. If you're not familiar, by the way, with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, go to attack.mitre.org. And it is a framework that outlines and catalogs and categorizes all the threat actions that are taken by cyber criminals, so that you can kind of get a sense of what they're doing, how they're doing it, what your mitigation strategy is, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the tactics is credential access. And so a lot of these methodologies here really have to do with just gaining access through one way or another to a credential. And so once that's done, though, then you have these other tactics here. You see discovery, lateral movement, collection, command and control, exfiltration, and so on. All these that are here, all are going to rely on whatever has been grabbed at credential access, not necessarily the initial account. Like in the case of this Midnight Blizzard folks, a guy who got access to a test tenant account and then used OAuth. They got access to other accounts. So this is more like, I might get access to one credential, do some discovery, and then I find another system, and then I end up getting another credential, and then I'm able to laterally move. And then once I laterally move the right system, maybe I figure out how to elevate privileges and give myself access to that system and get another credentialed access to then do collection and so on. So it might be a bit of back and forth between credential access and these other post-credential access tactics. But at the center, it always comes back to, I've got to have the privilege, I got to have the access. So it's great to try and stop these things, the different threat actions as they occur. So let's take something like under the impact, you have like data exfiltration, or so. Actually, that's under exfiltration. You have the exfiltration of data there, or maybe you have something like under impact, maybe like in a ransomware attack where data is encrypted. But the idea is, yes, we could stop those things, but that feels a lot like we're more treating the symptom than we are treating the actual source of the illness, and that is that they have credentialed access. And you have any comments here? Would you agree?
Oh yeah, no comments. Truly comprehensive coverage of the topic.
Easy enough here. So looking at like sort of hybrid lateral movement a little bit here. This is a security report came out late last year on hybrid security trends by a company called Redux. And I just want you to focus in on these two areas here. You see they have user account compromised both in the cloud and on premises, darker being in the cloud, lighter being on premises, and then an admin account compromise. Now, the percentages aren't like 87%, they're lower percentages, but what I did find interesting is that they're not equal. I know that 12 and 17% are not the same thing, but it's not like one of them is 48 and one of them is 4. They're kind of in the same ballpark. Same thing, on user compromise, that both the cloud and on premises, these are the percentage of organizations that have experienced either user or admin account compromise, either in the cloud or on premises in the last 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found it very interesting that just the idea of hybrid lateral movement doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be on premises and then move to the cloud. It might be starting in the cloud and move back to on premises. And so, but it always is going to start with this account compromise. You have to talk anything to add?
Yeah, interesting stats. I wasn't familiar with them, but I just want to add on the top, you grayed out phishing, but I think we should all remember what is the target of phishing attacks? It's to grab your credentials, right? In a phishing attack, you get a malicious link, redirecting you to a forged web page that says you need to log in to your Office 365 account or whatever. It's like the phishing. Actually, I would say you can call it that's the preparatory step in order for you in order for the attacker to perform a user account or an admin account compromise. And I would say, now I'm not sure about the ransomware or other malware attack, okay, but at least in the ransomware case, ransomware, like according to the stats and what we see firsthand in the field, more than 85% of ransomware attacks involve lateral movement. So in a way, I think that the presence of credential access, privilege escalation, and lateral movement is actually, I mean, I think we could easily leave the phishing and ransomware in their original colors, because they're definitely part of this entire picture.
So it's a great point. Going back to just my example of the Netscope monitoring of Cloudflare and seeing that 61x jump in credential related attacks. Those were all basically what they were doing. They were seeing impersonated websites like, Bank of America or Microsoft in specific was the 61x, but it could be any vendor they're trying to impersonate, but it was just this massive uptick in hosted impersonated logon pages for exactly what you're talking about. And I'm trying to think if there was another stat from last year. I read an article about the massive increase on the focus of phishing attacks. And I want to think that the number was something like 78% of all phishing attacks were related to credential compromise. But if nothing else, don't quote me on that, but take it as kind of like it's that bad. And that's really kind of the focus for the most part. That's a whole lot easier than it is to try and convince somebody to download something that they should install and then hope that they don't have endpoint protection in there and that kind of thing. So another bit of stats here. I pulled these from your report last year. The folks at Silverfort worked with Osterman Research to do a state of the identity attack surface. And there was a couple of interesting things that I saw here. Was first off, just pointing out that the very high percentage, even if you and the audience don't agree necessarily with the percentage of the hybrid deployment being 82% of organizations, I think we all can agree, although I think the number is accurate, it's probably really close, but even if you don't, you know that it's more than 50%. It's a lot more than 50%. Most organizations have some kind of hybrid deployment where they are having to manage stuff in the cloud and therefore have to have unified credentials to be able to access both environments. And then just tied with that is from the same report here was the idea of going back to that slide where I showed you the MITRE ATT&CK framework and talking about, it's great to try and stop one of these actions that are over on the right in the red, but you really have to stop it at the credentialed access. This goes back to the idea of how well can organizations actually stop lateral movement. And you'll note here that it's only 22% is actually like we can absolutely stop lateral movement without a problem. Definitely. That means like 70, whatever that is, 77.6% are like, we can stop some of it, or we're not sure we can, or we can't at all. Right? I mean, this is a very bad chart for those in the audience. So you think about, can you stop lateral movement? I think that even you all would agree. If you really think about, can I stop lateral movement? You're probably somewhere. This is probably accurate in terms of if you can or can't. Yiftach?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, this research report we've done with Osterman, so we've polled organizations worldwide. We asked them, what do they think? It was important for us to sort of try to grasp how identity security people perceive the problem. Well, we're now, again, we'll soon be releasing a report that shows the actual data from the environments. And like when I see here that 22.4% think that it have high confidence, I don't know, like seems to me now that the world is divided into those who think they can, who think they can block lateral movement, and to those who know they can't. And I would even argue that if I was able to counter these 22.4% with the data that we'll gather from their environments, I dare say that this high confidence rate will drop significantly.
So we should call that overconfident? Is that what that column should be
Yeah,
named?
yeah. I would say I would love to write overconfident, but it's not the type of language that you use in reports, right? Because but like if privately, I think it's definitely an overconfidence. I've actually seen very few organization. This one ties very nicely into the next part of this webinar. It's like, due to the inherent weaknesses and gaps and vulnerabilities within the attack surface, so it's an uphill battle. So in order to, it's not impossible to win this battle, but in the state that we are now, the only organization that I've seen and was convinced that they have a fair chance in beating lateral movement attacks are ones that have tons of resources, right? That they can, that they have the security team, they can have, I don't know, 10 people sitting in the SOC doing nothing but monitoring users' behavior, responding immediately to every, again, it's not impossible, but I think due to the data that will and to the analysis that we'll soon see, it's incredibly hard. I would say like I think that the real answer, the high confidence, I would drop it into maybe like 4%, maybe 5%, and these will be the organizations that have reached the top maturity in terms of recognizing the cyber threat and investing resources respectively.
You've talked just while it's on my mind. If you ever run this report again and you ask this same question, here's what you do. You ask the people who answered high confidence in the next question, have you actually stopped? You got an instance where you stopped lateral movement. If they go no, it's like, okay, at least you have your answer for sure. You're like, yes, we have. Okay, well then those are the people that definitely know they can. Everyone else is just super confident. Couple comments came in here. Going back to like the Microsoft conversation, you've talked for a second here. Alan has mentioned, do you prefer OAuth 2 or OpenID for authentication? And I think like in the case of the Microsoft attack, I don't think the methodology really was the issue, to your point that you made it. So I want to kind of pose this to you about, do you have a preference and that sort of thing? But it was more about what you said, which is they were using a very high level account more than likely to create this test tenant in the first place, and weren't really considering the repercussions of doing so. So do you have a preference on authentication methods at all?
Not necessarily. I mean both options that you stated, OpenID and OAuth 2. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them inherently. It's just the way you use them. I mean, there are, and we'll see them onward. There are some legacy authentication protocols that are insecure, that are literally insecure. That's not the case here. I think it's more a matter of implementation and malpractices rather than a problem with the protocol itself.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. Another question came in here from Nicholas. Nicholas says having much less admin compromise in the cloud environment makes sense. And back in these stats from that networks report, I think it was 17% of admin accounts on premises and 12% in the cloud, if I remember correctly. And Nicholas mentions due to native controls available, he's wondering. And I think the answer there is actually sort of the opposite. It's the prevalence and the availability of on-premises tools to gain elevated permissions. It's tougher in the cloud because there's not as many things you can do. You don't have, if you think of like if you were able to get, let's say, a low-level account in Microsoft 365, just go with that for a second. All you can really do with that account is log into the applications that account has access to. You don't have access to, for example, an operating system that is inside of the environment as you would on premises, where you have an entire desktop that you've now taken control over, that you can then run tools and download things to, and you have a base with from which to work. And I think that's really why there's less admin account compromise in the cloud. I mean, you have to talk. What's your take on that?
So I have two takes. First of all, I would say, as a rule of thumb, okay, the on-prem is much more flawed than the cloud, right? The potential it's much, like, I would say, once you're inside, it's much easier. Okay, there's no doubt. Now, on the other hand, of course, the cloud is inherently insecure because the cloud resides a password, username and password away from literally anyone, right? While the on-prem networks resides, I don't know, still it's supposed to be at least hidden from the outside world. So I think these two kind of balance each other. And I think, like, what you said about this, like, low privileged account, that's right, given that the person that configured the entitlements and the privileges that this team had really done its work good enough. Okay, once you have 20,000 users, it becomes complex. And then again, many teams will take the easy route of saying, okay, fine, who cares? Yeah, I mean, of course, he's only the new junior finance guy, but yeah, whatever. Let him access everything that we have within this tenant. This is not an uncommon scenario. So I would say definitely the cloud, in terms of configuration, in terms of overall credential exposures, is definitely more secure. It was built in modern times. It's better, okay, but I think it really depends on the way you configure and manage the access and entitlements over there.
No, I would agree here. And then there was another question that came in from Christopher. It's rather long. Christopher, I'm going to wait till the end of our webinar to cover your questions. It's a little more general, but also I think some of the stuff that Yiftach is going to show will somewhat answer some of your questions. So I'm going to hold off on your question, but I did see it. And then John mentions about, do I have a link to that Microsoft security guide? And my answer is no, but for two reasons. One, I don't have it because it's many years old. But two, I would tell you to probably go look at the Center for Internet Security, CIS, and look up CIS security guide. Version 8, I think they're on now, and they've got a whole bunch of security guides that tell you how to lock down. That could be a Windows endpoint, a Windows servers, Linux, Active Directory, Azure AD, all kinds of stuff. So that's probably where I would suggest you actually look instead, is go to CIS security controls go to the CIS Center for Internet Security and look at their security controls. There we go. I was making up a name of a company, I think, right there. Then the last thought I've got, and Yiftach, I'm going to hand things over to you, is just talking about, for you guys, what constitutes a weak identity attack surface. And I mentioned this first bullet at the beginning of the webinar today. Like, yes, because we all know, like, insecure passwords or something that's on the have I been pwned list. We just had the mother of all breaches, MOAB, as it's been called. That's the 24 billion records. It's just out there that people can use. And while that might not be your specific account, the idea is they might have an email address and they could try to cross-reference it with any of the passwords in there to try and see if you use any of the common ones, et cetera, because people are pretty predictable. And so, like, it's funny, if you mentioned having like the same password on a lot of systems, or you make it was more of a scenario, but I have literally no two systems anywhere in my life that have the same password. None, not a single one at all. I have them all inside of a Vault application, and that Vault application is offline. And so that way it's not accessible. It's 512-bit encrypted, blah, 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 that kind of thing. So,
yeah. So that's amazing. I really feel that I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to actually share
it's not
webinar space with you. If that's the case.
I have a nomenclature where I can sometimes guess because I know how I think, but no two are the same. And that's just because, and I always tell my kids, if nothing else, just make sure your bank isn't the same, and make sure that your email, which is of course the core of everything you do, make that super long and secure, and then also put in two-factor. And I have, all my kids do that. So I actually do sort of practice what I preach. All right, so weak identity attack surface, weak password requirements, right? That's the first thing. So, 8 characters can be whatever you want. Password is fine. Yeah, that's bad. We all knew that. We can skip this one. The next one is no least privilege and preferably no zero standing privilege. If you're not familiar with probably zero standing privilege, I'll cover least first. Least privilege would be, let me figure out the least amount of privileges you actually need to accomplish your job or someone else's job in the organization, and we only assign that person those rights, and that's all they have. Sometimes least privilege also includes separating privileged accounts from non-privileged accounts. So even an IT person might have a privileged account to do privileged stuff, but might have a low-level account for utilizing Word and surfing the web and responding to email. But zero standing privilege takes it a step farther, where you're actually determining what people's privileges are and then maintaining that somehow in some solution that keeps track of what all the privileges are and only assigns them at the time of need. So therefore, there's nothing standing out there. Even though you have admin access, it doesn't actually exist until the moment you need it. And then it's assigned, it's granted to you, you do the work you need to do, you log out, and it's taken away. So if a bad guy gets access to your account afterwards, they don't have any privileges because there's no standing privileges whatsoever. So that might be another, if you don't have that in place, that's another potential weak attack surface because you have all these established privileges. Keep in mind, if Bob's our database administrator, we give Bob admin rights to a box hosting SQL server, virtual box that is, I'm showing my age. Then if someone gets access to Bob's account, they have total access to all the databases. I mean, it's standing privilege. So instead, no standing privilege is a good place to be as well. Little consideration for the potential for hybrid privilege. And this goes back to sort of like the example you provided, when we were talking about the Microsoft issue. Theirs, of course, was like tenant to tenant, and it's cloud to cloud. But that same kind of principle, they really didn't consider what someone can do if they gain access to an account on that tenant, how they could work backwards. And it's the same thing. There's little consideration for if I create an account and I sync it up to Azure AD and what rights I give it in the cloud, and thinking about it in both directions. What can somebody do if they compromise one side of the hybrid lateral movement and go to the other side? And then no additional authentication factors, kind of self-explanatory. You should have MFA for everybody. Everybody should have everyone. Even that person you're thinking, not that guy. No, yeah, that guy too. Everybody. The mail clerk, yes, MFA, everybody. And then no policy or controls over account access. I'm sort of just politely saying like a privileged access or privileged account management. PAM, some kind of PAM solution, something we have policies and control. Who can access it? Does it require approval? Is it going to be monitored? Is it going to be recording in the session? Those kinds of things. Yiftak, anything you'd add to this list?
No, but I'll probably refer to this list as we go on because a lot of what we're going to see basically undermines everything we see here. Like even if you implement everything that we have here, okay, I would argue that they can be overcome by reasons that at least some of them are beyond our control. But I don't want to do any spoilers, though. But this is definitely decent coverage of what should be the best practices to maintain your identity attack surface as secure as possible.
Yep, I'd agree. So a couple of questions have come in. Let me see if I can answer some of these here. Ali, I hope I said your name right, says, isn't it obvious using passkeys along with physical security keys, phishing resistant, because it's based on public-private keys and not passwords? I would agree with the technical ability there. The challenge becomes making it super easy for users to use, and therein becomes part of the problem with doing public-private keys. It's just that it's got to exist somewhere, and someone's going to make it. I'm assuming it already exists. Someone's got a solution somewhere, I'm assuming, but there has to be a solution that makes it super easy where to the user, they're just pressing a button or something like that. It can't be always, and I have the right key installed on the right system and so on, because that becomes not user friendly. And that's probably why, even though that's a great solution, it isn't the one that everybody uses, so to speak here. Bruno asks, what's the offline pass manager? I use a product called Data Vault. It's old, it's clunky, it's ugly. It's like $8 and you can get it for Android and Apple and Mac and Windows and whatever you want. But I like that because it's so old. And it's like to me, it's like the Navajo Indians or something during World War II. Like no one spoke Navajo because it's so old and clunky, so to speak. And so that's why using Morse code today, no one knows that is. And so, is it the best one on the planet? No, but I keep everything in there, and it's just all offline. They have an option like sync with a browser. I don't even do that. I keep everything offline. I'll go look it up. It's okay. And then, I can copy and paste out of it or something like that if I want to. And let me see what else I have in here. Christopher added some more context to his question, so I'm still going to wait on that, Christopher. That's okay. And then Michael says, are zero standing privileges obfuscating privilege from an attacker? Is there room for an attacker to determine that the system like this is in place and make a legitimate request for elevation? I don't know the answer to the second part of your question. Is it possible for them to get around it? But the concept with zero standing privilege type solutions is we will figure out where you've given rights. Like I'm thinking of a solution I happen to know, which I'm not going to name because I don't want to promote products here. That's not my goal. But they will figure out where rights are. They will put a group there that has no membership, but they control that group, and that group has access that let's say the person had. And then when the person who's supposed to get rights to that particular endpoint wants rights to that endpoint, they will stick that person in that group, and then boom, that person has rights. So is it flawless? No, I don't think it's going to be flawless necessarily. But the idea is just that when someone just breaks into an environment, looks around, it's like, hello, any admins here? Anybody? And there's no one responding, but just echoes, because no one's technically an admin at all until the point in time when they need admin rights. So it's in concept, I'm going to say it sounds good, like it works. I don't mean like you're supposed to read in that like it doesn't actually work. I mean, it sounds good. It just in practice, I don't know, because that second half of your question is really telling. It's like, is there room for an attacker to figure out that this exists? And then can they go and ask for rights like they should be? Or, and in theory, yeah, like go back to a PAM solution. In theory, if all the policies and control over access to an elevated account is you need to ask for it from your account on that machine. Well, if you're the bad guy and you're on that machine with the account that you're supposed to be using, guess what? You get access to the elevated credential. So, nothing's foolproof. It's all about having the policy and control over the whole thing. And then let me see what else here. I'll tell you what, I'm gonna keep going because I don't want. I'm already digging into your time, Yiftach, and I'm gonna hold the rest of the questions till the end here if I can. So with that, in a moment here, I'm gonna pass control over to Yiftach. He's gonna kind of redo his dive into looking at the most common security gaps, but take it a little bit farther. So talk about a little bit on-premises lateral movement, but also talk about maybe doing some hybrid lateral movement as well, and talk about how it's possible to detect these kinds of things. So with that, Yiftach, I'm gonna go ahead and make you presenter, and I will let you know when I can see your screen.
Okay.
I see agenda, so if that's your slide, you're up. Floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So short, what are we going to cover? We'll talk about identity threat exposures. This is a term that I coined specifically for this webinar, okay? Because and we'll refer to them as ITE. Identity threat exposures is anything that makes attacker's life easier in terms of performing identity threats. They are not vulnerabilities. They're not malware. We'll soon dive deeper into them. We'll understand different types of ITEs that they are. We'll go over the killers, NTLM, shadow admin service accounts, and some other nuggets as well. We'll talk about the AD password sync secret. Okay, AD password sync is a very common practice today, right? Everyone that has both Active Directory and either Azure, Entra, Okta, whatever. The common practice to sync the AD passwords or the AD hashes with what you have in the cloud, and we'll realize what I don't know, an unknown amazing security gap this practice encloses, and we'll talk about how on-prem ITs have become the ultimate SaaS attack vector. And I think that will be the most interesting part. This is where we'll tie everything that we'll cover so far. I always say that I always forget. By the end of each slide, I'll pause and definitely, Nick, if there are any questions from the audience or any comments from your side, I would be really happy to take them. Okay.
Wonderful. Let's do it.
Okay. Pause. All good. Okay.
You're good. No, I mean, as you were. Let's do that. It sounds like a great plan.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the ITE's root causes. Okay, you have here this is taken from the movie The Three Musketeers. Of course, there are four, as everyone who sees the movie or read the book know. What causes an identity threat exposure? First is malpractice. Okay, and we'll see. And malpractice, for example, is something like a shared user account. Okay, I would love to poll all the. I would say. I would love to poll the audience and ask, do you have shared accounts in your environment? Account that is shared by several individuals? Well, Most organizations do. This is a one killer of a malpractice. There are others, however. There's also the misconfiguration. Okay, misconfiguration. We'll see that soon when we'll talk about shadow admins, unconstrained delegations, which we won't touch upon in this webinar. Managing an identity infrastructure is complex, tedious, and hard work, right? And it's error prone, and misconfigurations are one of the key causes for identity threat exposures. There's legacy infrastructure. Okay, now it starts to become interesting because, at least in theory, malpractice and misconfiguration can be eliminated, right? But what will you do if you still have NTLM-v1 in your environment because they're critical applications that were written in-house 20 years ago, and removing NTLM-v1 will crash them, for example. So legacy infrastructure is much harder to overcome than the other two. And the fourth one is built-in feature. Okay, this is I think I'll just mention it now, and we'll talk about it later. Suppose you have service accounts with SPN, or any admin account that has SPN is associated with I assume everybody knows what an SPN is. It's service principal. Sorry, and this is one of the built-in features in Active Directory. Okay, but this feature that you cannot eliminate or cannot take away exposes you to various attacks. So this is the overall exposition. I'm pausing.
There's just a question about the password itself being complex. Christopher says that the password's really complex and can't be cracked using a hash. Do you consider that a mitigation against, like, a sync password issue?
In a way, I would argue, and I'll say that if you've really invested in a very, very, very complex password, that's amazing. Okay, it definitely reduces the chance of it's being cracked. It does not eliminate them, and we'll see that in just a short minute. So there are tens of different ITEs. The inclusion criteria for here, we'll talk about ITEs that are impactful, okay, meaning they facilitate significant malicious activity, and they either facilitate or directly enable malicious activity. They have to be exploitable, okay. If any of you is familiar with the CVE scoring mechanism, okay. So for a vulnerability to be considered critical, it has to be, the attacker must have a way to be aware of the existence of this vulnerability, and also have enough privileges to exploit it. And they also have to be prevalent. Okay, again, we've gathered I'll show here. I will share with you some samples of data that we've gathered from hundreds of environments. We've seen ITEs that are common, and we've seen ITEs that are very unique. Like, for example, some users are configured without pre-authentication. Okay, this exposes them to ask for pro-sting attack, but this is a extremely uncommon ITE. Okay, so even though it's risky and because it exposes you to attack, it's not one that you're likely to encounter in your environment. So everything we'll talk about here is common. Common basically means that I assume that from the audience here, it's likely that each one of you will have at least one of them in the environment that he or she is currently running. Now, what are the attacks that ITEs enable? Okay, there are ITEs that enable password access. Okay, the whole essence, they enable the disclosure of the clear text password. There are ITEs that enable privilege escalation. Okay, and if the attacker now has a hold in a low privilege account, the ITE will enable him to elevate his access privileges and access more resources. There are ITEs that facilitate lateral movement, and it will enable the attacker to access multiple resources without being detected. And there's also a fourth group, which basically it's assists the attacker in evading detection. I will well, I'll say will probably disclose that I'm in terms of age, I'm nearing the end of my 40s. Like when I was a kid, my favorite computer game was Pac-Man. So think of the attacker as the Pac-Man, and each one of these has a different type of cherry that the attacker can bite and gain some additional powers over the monsters that it didn't have before. If we, I'll segue to the next slide, and only then I'll pause. If we want to sort of put them across a kill chain, okay, so credential access, privilege escalation, lateral movement, these one logically follow one another. We can sometimes see attack that sort of scheme through all these ITs. Sometimes only one of them. We've seen them of all kinds. So now, before I start deep diving into them, I'll pause and ask, and if there's any questions from the audience or Nick, or any comments from you, Nick, I'll be happy to take them.
Sorry, I thought I had to mute off. Just one. Let's see. Christopher says Cherry was just points. Power-ups gave power to the monsters. I'm too old. That's all I have so far.
Yeah, I know. I mean, yeah, that's I know. So in this analogy, the Pac-Man is the bad guy, and the monsters are the good people that are attending this webinar. Okay.
Very good.
Okay. Cool. So let's start with the password exposure ITs. Okay. I mean, I'm not a graphic designer. Okay. So you have to excuse the lame design, but this basically what they do. They sort of hand out the password to attacker. How do they do that? So let's start. We'll talk about three of them, okay? NTLM v2, that's the standard NTLM that we have, okay? And NTLM v1, and admins with SPN, with associated SPN, okay? Now, the first two, the NTLM, enable the attackers to harvest their hash by either dumping the memory from the endpoint itself, or from spoofing it through the network in some kind of man-in-the-middle attack. Admins with SPN, they are exposed to Kerber roasting. All three of them enable the attacker to get a user's hash, take it offline, and crack it. Okay, and let's dive in again. And this is the exposition. Now let's talk about each and every one of them. So NTLM authentication, okay, I assume everyone here knows what it is. I won't deep dive into that, but the important thing about NTLM is to remember that it uses the hash as an equivalent to the password, okay? The password is converted into an NTLM hash within the memory of the machine, and it is transacted between the client and the server for the purpose of validation. Now, here let's do some drill. Okay, this is taken from one of the latest Microsoft I don't know, newsletters or whatever. So I want to read to you this. Kerberos has been the default Windows authentication protocol since 2000, but there are still scenarios where it can't be used and where Windows falls back to NTLM, okay? Now, I ask you, Nick, and the audience, okay? Based on this sentence, what do you think is the percentage of NTLM authentication out of all authentications in an Active Directory environment? Like, what's the proportion between NTLM and Kerberos, based on the language that's used here? I'm waiting.
When it reads there are still scenarios, it feels a lot like, it's like 8%. It's 11%. It feels like it's material, but it's not material, is my guess. But Garrett says 10%.
10%. Do we hear more?
50%. Yeah. Christopher says 50%.
50%.
Matuz, I hope I said your name right, 5 to 10%.
5 to 10, okay.
We'll wait and see if we get 25, says John.
25.
Large enterprises use AD, a ton of small businesses do not, Orta says. And let's see. RF says 40%. Let's keep going. What do you think? Keep going. You know the answer, do you?
40. Okay, so sold.
Oh, Matthias says way more. He says like 70. Matthias says 70.
Oh, okay, so Matthias, so sold to the gentleman that said 70. Actually, but I just want to say, like, Matthias, you said 70. I guess it was probably based on your own personal knowledge rather than deducing that from the language that was used here, right? I don't expect you to answer. I assume that's the case, right? Still scenario. So let's see what the numbers are truly are. And I'll ask you another thing before that, actually. If we pick a random account in an AD environment, okay? So what would you think? Is this account, are accounts typically mostly NTLM or mostly Kerberos, or do they feature an unpredictable behavior? Okay, what do you think? What do you think, Nick?
I mean, I'm assuming it's based off of the way that the workstation's configured, so I'm thinking it'd be a predictable behavior, but you're going to tell me that I'm wrong anyway, so go ahead.
Okay, so let's see how prevalent NTLM v2 actually is. So in a standard environment, you have 34% accounts that do more than 80%, that are mostly Kerberos. Mostly is more than 80% of authentications. You have 16% that are just NTLM, and you have 48% which are both. Basically, it means, okay, that 64% of your accounts authenticate in NTLM on a regular basis. Okay, this is, I think it's like, for me, for me, it came as a surprise. It basically means that not only NTLM is prevalent, is here, it's here at large. Okay, basically it means, and remember, every NTLM authentication basically means that you have a user hash wandering, aimlessly in the network, residing in some endpoint memory. This is an alarming figure. Okay, if we'll take another breakdown and we'll say, and let's break it down based on authentication traffic, you see that the number rises, right? You see, like, even though before the Kerberos, in terms of accounts, it was a higher percentage of Kerberos, when we're talking about the actual authentication, you see that the number rises. Actually, if for non-admin accounts, it's 46%. For admin accounts, it's 37%. The reason is that unlike a Kerberos ticket, that you, like, if you are accessing an on-prem application, if you're doing it through Kerberos, okay, so you do the initial authentication, you get the ticket, it's valid for 8 hours. With NTLM, if it's NTLM, so every interaction of the app with the database will trigger another authentication. So not only NTLM is less secure, okay, it also spreads its insecurity in a much higher volume than Kerberos. Okay, and basically, I think, again, in terms of security, it means that if I'm an attacker, if I'm a pen tester, I mean, I've done that as a pen tester. As an attacker, I have excellent chances of harvesting an admin password hash, or not, or standard user's password hash. And again, relating back to say, okay, if it is a super complicated password, I might not be able to crack this hash. But the NTLM encryption algorithm, it's RC4, it's not as good as it's not as good and strong as it should. And I would argue that more than 60% of the people here, of the audience here, their passwords are from the type that you can definitely crack offline from the NTLM hash. Okay, now even worse. Okay, no, actually, before I proceed, just out of curiosity only, who does this come as a surprise to anyone here? I mean, maybe everyone knew that already, but I don't know. It's like, if there's someone here who's surprised, by all means, post your comment, and I'll see that later. It just really, yeah, it's
There was a question that Christopher brought up. He says, isn't there always at least one initial NTLM authentication before Kerberos ticket can be established for whatever object or service?
It is, but let's assume we've taken this data over a time frame of 30 days. Okay, so I assume, and some of it was from very large environments. So this sort of initial NTLM authentication took place already. Okay, and it's again, even when you when you think of the proportions, and when you take into account all the accounts that are mostly NTLM, okay. I mean, we actually, I mean, this was the response of one of our researchers. He said maybe all of this is account of we can sort of relate that to the initial NTLM authentication, and the answer was no. Like the numbers are too high. Okay, so if NTLM is bad, NTLM v1 is even worse. Okay, NTLM v1 is the I would say the insecure bigger brother legacy protocol. Okay, and which by as a consensus, it's one of the easiest to crack. Theoretically, and I'm saying now, I'll put my product hat. In many environments, people think that they don't have NTLM v1 authentication at all. And it's actually quite hard to detect that unless you manually go over account and make sure that the NTLM v1 is either checked or unchecked. In practice, if we'll see, and it happens because, again, I think we talked about that before. There are legacy apps and old devices that can't be upgraded to support it. If you simply disable that, you might break processes. Discovering which apps and devices rely on NTLM v1, again, manual and tedious task. And there are also some VPN products, by the way, much more than you think, that require NTLM v1 due to radius compatibility. Now, taking all that into account, so this is the prevalence table, okay? Hosts, meaning machines that operate as the NTLM v1 client, it's like 7% on average. Servers 2%. Users 5%, and admins 7%. This is again, like I would say, 7% might not sound that alarming, okay? But basically, think of the implications. It's extremely easy as an attacker, if I land on a machine, it's very easy to figure out if NTLM v1 authentication is supported or not. And if I discover that it is, I just have to wait. If by any chance, and if there's a good, again, based on experience, I won't have to wait too long before one of these admins will just drop his hash in this memory, okay? Or if I'm taking the proactive approach, setting up, I don't know, responder or any other man in the middle attack, I'll be able to identify these hashes and capture them. Okay, so if you remember the image that we started with, the waiter that hands the password on a tray, this I think this is definitely can be considered a silver tray. Any questions?
None so far. No, nothing. I think you're doing just fine. Christopher just made a comment. He was asking about the percentages where they were claiming all Kerberos, saying there's got to be some NTLM in there, but it's fine. Keep going. You're on the right path.
Okay, cool. I'll talk briefly about admins of the SPN, right? So there's accounts that are associated with a service principal name. Okay, this is a default feature in a window in any Windows domain. Now, problem is that when you have an account associated with an SPN, this paves the way to Kerberoasting. Okay, and Kerberoasting, how does it work? I'm inside the network. Okay, I'm in the post-compromise. Now I identify accounts with associated SPN. There are tons of free tools and scripts that enable me to do that. Now, once I do that, I choose one of them, and then I request a ticket granting service to this SPN. Now, of course, I won't get access, but I'll get the TGS. Now, the TGS is encrypted with the service account's NTLM hash. Now, again, I can take it offline. I can crack the ticket offline. And now I have the password for this admin account with the SPN. Okay? Now, you probably, at this point, some of you will probably think, why am I relating to this as password exposure rather than privilege escalation, which is usually in many cases is the motivation behind launching a Kerberos hosting attack. So for those of you who asked that, it will be solved in a minute. So I've taken only these three, the admin, the SPN, and the NTLM plus NTLM v1. They are the most common. Okay, they are admins with SPN. We sort of when we classify organizations by size, it's in small 20%, almost 20% of admins are associated with APN. Medium organization, almost 10%. In large, 6%. These are significant numbers. Okay, so if I'm after an admin credential and I've already set up a foothold within the network, I've already compromised the endpoint, I just have to sort of periodically run the script, find the user that is associated with it, the users that are associated with SPN, and launch this attack. This is, and again, this is one of the attacks that introduces the hardest challenge for security teams. Again, because you must have the SPN in order for users to access applications. Before I move to the privilege escalators, again, any comments?
One question came in again from Christopher. He's definitely zeroed in on everything you're talking about. It says, can I use Active Directory users and computers to identify whether at least some account has an accessible SPN or just more arcane tools? I'm thinking he may have to go use either like LDAP to find it or AdCedit or something like that. Do you know?
It's tricky. Okay.
Yeah.
It's tricky because you can't always discern. It's not the easiest thing to tell between an SPN that should be there, okay, because again it's associated with an existing application that users access, and an SPN that was just that's assigned, I don't know, maybe by default, maybe just maybe inadvertently. It's, again, as I said before, it's not impossible. It's hard. If you have a person available to sit and do that, by all means. But it's not an existing filter you can just click on and get the results.
Okay. Fair enough. That's all the questions we got so far.
Cool.
We've got about 23 minutes left, just FYI. Not trying to rush you, but just so you know.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So privilege escalations. So this also discloses my age, right? I mean, I don't know if any kids today know who this person here, but this is Popeye, the sailorman, and when he eats the spinach, he becomes the strongest person on earth. And this is how privilege escalation works. I want to talk about shadow admins. Okay, shadow admins. Okay, this we had this slide in the latest webinar. What is a shadow admin? It's an admin for our purpose that has power over it's a user that for some reason, probably some misconfiguration or someone messed up. Again, Active Directory permission tree is it's something that's extremely complicated to manage. And we have the user Jane. The user Jane, for some reason, has the ability to reset password or add group. It can modify the legitimate admin Bob. Okay, admin Bob is a true admin. User Jane is a standard user that has been assigned this privilege by mistake. Now, sometimes it's even more complicated than that. You have user Joe that can reset the password. User Jane that can reset the password of admin Bob. Okay. Now, and again, unfortunately, for an attacker, discovering whether you have whether as a standard user you might have a privilege over users in the privilege groups, it's again, it's very easy, common tools, really common practice. Now, what happens here is that if I can reset the password, so if user Jane can reset the password of user Bob, so by all means, you are resetting the password. We're using admin Bob to access whatever admin Bob is entitled to access. If we do that fast enough, and then we cover our tracks by maybe resetting it back. Okay, this is something, again, this is if you closely monitor your environment, you can you might be able to detect that, but again, it poses a significant challenge. In more detail, you have a member of the domain administrators group, and you have a non-member, okay, but it's assigned permission that provide control admin users, and you can do either one of what we have here: replicating, resetting, read-write properties, change permission access. If we see the stats, okay, so in small organizations, 4% of non-admin users are shadow admins of that sort. Medium, 4%. Large, 1.2%. Again, this is a large number, okay? And these are the common root causes, okay? It either have the ability to reset password, write properties, modify owner permissions, and other like replicating the directory, changing permissions, etc. It's really common, and I actually wrote to MITRE. I think they have shadow admins over there, but they relate to an admin that the attacker creates, rather than which is the 100% malicious activity, rather to the actual exposure that we have that we have here. And one of the interesting things is that we have defined what we call the shadow burst, and basically think of it like this. Suppose if on Sunday I check my environment, no shadow admins. Monday, no shadow admins. Tuesday, no shadow admins. And then there was one single misconfiguration. Now, in average, such a single misconfiguration can trigger between the minimum is 70, maximum is 1,000. The average is 108 new shadow admins. It means that they have a highly volatile nature. And you have to continuously monitor your environment, because at any given moment, okay, someone from the identity team might have mistakenly misconfigured this or that, and boom, you have this spike. Now, we have seen in the time that in the 30 days time frame that we've monitored the organizations that we've surveyed, again, several hundreds of them, 30% of them experienced a burst of at least 7 new shadow admins. Okay, I assume, again, only a guess, if we would have monitored for more than 30 days, I don't know, 60 days, 90 days, I assume the percentage will rise up again. Any questions on shadow admins so far?
Yeah, there's a couple that came in here. Christopher says, does the shadow admin need to be a domain level admin, or can a domain user be given administrator access to a local machine, like workstation, let's say, and be leveraged in this same way?
Both. It doesn't really matter what it doesn't really matter what's the privilege level of the original user, of the shadow admin itself. What matters is what is the privilege level of the true admin that the shadow admin has power on.
And then another question came in from Mike. Mike says, what kind of 80 groups or permission settings should be monitored to detect shadow admins?
Within Active Directory, it's within Active Directory itself. It's hard. It's really hard. I've seen some, really sophisticated PowerShell scripts that do that, but it's not trivial.
Okay, and then there's one other question came in. Can a user local admin rights to a PC be considered a shadow admin or leveraged to become one? Is that what I think that's what you're sort of saying beforehand, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
That's all I've got for right now. Let's keep going.
Okay, cool. So lateral movement ITs. Okay, this is taken from the second movie of Indiana Jones. They have at the ending scene these carts that flow around. I mean, that's the best visual image that I could come up with. So we have service accounts. I think I'll skim through that, okay, because we've talked about in detail on service accounts. Just want to say, everyone knows that it's a problem, right? There are tons of them. They're invisible. They're highly privileged, and many times they are created without any documentation, and I think they're one of the hardest security challenges that we see. And again, this is a built-in features. You can't just eliminate service accounts. I think in the attacks that we've analyzed firsthand, we've seen more than 75% of incidents where there was lateral movement involved. It took place with a service account. Now, they also have apparently they also break down. They're more the breakdown is more. It's better than standard users, but still a lot of them. 27% with NTLM, 90% are hybrid. These numbers are definitely alarming. I'm gonna really I'll skim over this, okay? Because I assume most of you know what service accounts are, and I think what's important for me is to go this and then to the
You went out for a second there, Yiftach. We're not hearing you.
nugget of this webinar. All around users, okay? So far, we've talked about admins, right? Everyone knows that admins are important. Attackers go after admin credentials. They want admins, etc., etc. Now, the problem is that what we've discovered is that in every environment, you have what we call all-around users. And these are standard users. They don't belong to any reason. I mean, the reason is, I don't know, some carelessness or unintentional or whatever. When the access policies were assigned, somehow these users managed to fall through the cracks, and they can access a high number of machines. They actually, based on the number of machines they can access, they are almost identical to admins. So as an attacker, I can use them for lateral movement. Okay, the prevalence is very high, and the adversarial exposure is high, and none of the security measures that I would use for my admins are applied to them, right? Because they're just users, and there are tons of them. Okay, in small organization, 6%, medium 15%, large 19%. This is again, these numbers are much higher than what I thought. And by the way, and I do urge, like, any one of you here in the audience that has his or her own environment to manage, I would definitely urge you to go back and ask yourself, what do I do with that? And does this really reflect what I have in-house? And if so, what can I do? We have the ITEs that enable you to evade detection. Okay, some of them are stale users. For example, you know, someone worked in the company and then he's long gone. For some reason, his account still lingers on. They're much more like stale users. They don't have any activity. Okay, most of the time they're not subject to any protection. Of course, not MFA or anything else. Again, as you can see from the numbers, they're also very prevalent. And we have shared accounts, which are definitely malpractice by itself. Now I want to tie it all together and basically say, we all know what AD sync to cloud IDP is, right? You have Active Directory and you have a cloud IDP. It could be Okta, it could be Azure AD. The same, by the way, holds true about federation services. Now, these are two different products, right? So this user, this person, have a user account and password configured in Active Directory, and also user account and a password configured in the cloud IDP. With this one, he accesses SaaS apps, and here he accesses resources on-prem. Now, of course, this contradicts the whole notion of SSO. So we have the password sync. Basically, password sync means that your password and hashes in Active Directory are synced to the cloud IDP. And now, if you are this user, you're using the same username and password to log in to your domain resources, as well as you do to your cloud IDP and the SaaS apps. Okay, this is how it's done in Microsoft Entra. This is how it's done in Okta. Now, but think of it. When you do this sync, you sync all users. The default is to sync all the users. And it means, for example, let's talk about shadow admins. Suppose I've compromised, I'm an attacker, I compromised the user one, and then I discover that user one has power over admin one. So basically, user one is actually shadow admin one. And then I reset admin's WAN password. And then I get off. I mean, I run away from the on-prem environment. I go to my computer. I open the browser, and I'm logging in with this new password that I've created to the SaaS environment. Okay, so even though this is an on-prem ITE, it actually paved my way as an attacker to the SaaS. Okay, another example. Let's talk about the NTLM v1, v2. Okay, I'm an attacker, right? And then this is an environment that has password sync. So I gain initial access. I've obtained user hash. Maybe through memory dump. Maybe I've done that from the network. Doesn't matter. I have the hash now. Now I can decrypt the hash offline, and then I can access the SaaS. And the SaaS, think of it. Even though we're hybrid, more and more companies hold their crown jewels in the SaaS, in their Office 365, in Box, in Salesforce. So here again, we have something that is 100% legacy, NTLM v1 and v2, but this legacy has opened an attacker way to your SaaS apps. And again, since the password sync applies to all accounts, so think what happens. All the active users are synced. That makes sense, right? I mean, if I'm in my organization, I need to access file servers on-prem and also Office 365. But guess what? You know who else gets synced? The stale users and the service accounts. They're synced. There are users that have, and that now the person that manages Entra or Okta is probably unaware of their existence. Okay, but they are still here. We actually discovered tons of these accounts that you can use to access access SaaS applications, because there's literally almost no policy that that limits that. So this is how all the on-prem ITEs, how this is how they reflect to the cloud environment, they expose the SaaS environment to malicious access. And I think want to wrap it up and take you and show you just for like 2 minutes our product. I don't know if we'll have the time for that, but I think the problem is, now I'm asking you, we've seen only 4 or 5 of these ITEs. Now there is no solution that out there that can actually even tell, like, first of all, most of these ITEs were new knowledge to many of us. Okay, it's not something that is part of the common knowledge corpus of an identity team or a security team. And exactly like Nick said, the only ones who really knows them in and out are the bad guys. And this is basically what makes the defense against identity-based attacks, against lateral movement, such an uphill fight. It's literally unfair, because there's so much unknown exposures and obstacles that we're not aware of, and the fact that our environments are synced, it means that it's not just the old junkyard of Active Directory that is exposed. It's everything. This new shiny SaaS car still rides on wheels taken from coaches from the Wild West. And this, I think this is something. I think this is quite alarming. And I just want to show you, this is what we've tried to solve with our product, with Silverfort. Basically, because of, that's great. Reconnect. Okay, you know something? I think I don't want to waste the time of the good people here, and if it won't reconnect in a minute, so we'll go straight to the Q&A, which I hope we have. So we build a product that actually shows you everything. It shows you if you have shadow admins, you see that. If you have admins with SPN, you see that. If you have Azure shadow admins, you see that as well. Stale users, shared accounts. And if you want to defend yourself against them, all you have to do, you can go here and you can configure a policy, and you say, let's configure a risk if I want to eliminate NTLM v1 from my environment, I will go here, and I will say whenever it's NTLM v1, if we have NTLM v1 authentication, do MFA, okay, or even deny access. Same would be for, again, for shadow admins, for stale users. We can detect, we detect all of them. We detect all of them. We provide you everything, and then we enable you to configure a policy. If, for example, you decide that you want to eliminate all NTLM traffic, so you can configure. So you can go to the product. You can say, let me configure a policy that every NTLM authentication is denied. It's basically if you want to make sure that a synced service account can't access SaaS applications, you go here, you take the policy, you say this service account, these are the resources that it accesses. Okay, whenever it deviates from that, block access, okay, or alert. The whole concept that we try to do here, and I apologize that I'm squeezing it into 2 minutes. It's basically give you visibility into all of these ITEs, and there's a lot more than we've talked about, and also enable you to take action and proactively prevent attackers from exploiting them for malicious access. So if there's any questions, I'll be really happy to take them now.
Yeah, there's a couple in here. Christopher says, can Silverfort be deployed and managed entirely on premises inside our perimeter at first, or does management have to be through cloud management?
Actually, the default and currently the practice we recommend is to do that on-prem. Okay, we also have the ability to do everything as a SaaS, but most of our customers rather have it on-prem.
Okay, excellent there. Comment came in from Chris as well. This is like constant internal pen testing, sort of, although you're just watching the authentications there. All right, so back to some of the other ones here. Christopher had a long question. I'm going to sort of abbreviate just because we have 4 minutes left here, but I'm going to abbreviate here. It says basically everything's on premises now, small number of employees in a single site. And then they're going to be moving to a hybrid environment where the Exchange server is being migrated to Microsoft 365. So they obviously have to sync up and that sort of thing. And so the question is, what's the biggest concern that they need to be looking for when they have Exchange in the cloud and everything else on site, AD controlled file servers, NTF permissions, and so on. So very much an AD on-premises centric environment, but you still have Azure AD in use because of Exchange Online, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments there?
Well, literally, you have to be concerned about everything we've just discussed. To try to pick up what's the, I think you need to assume that every time you are concerned that you've got that you got a password exposed in the on-prem, assume, okay, that it will be used to access the Office 365. And I think your biggest concern is to see what accounts were synced to Azure AD or to Entra ID, okay? What accounts were synced that are accounts that actually have no business in existing there, okay? And see how you can make sure that your access policies in Azure AD enable access only to the users that should have been synced in the first place.
And then there are a couple of questions. Fred asks about, does Silverfort have a university platform that will enable a user who does security monitoring with knowledge to know how to address identity-based attacks in a hybrid environment?
Short answer is yes. Okay,
that's easy enough. Is there a multi-tenant version or plans for one? Dave wants to know.
Multi-tenant as in what sense? As in the ability,
like for an MSP where they could have one instance, they log in, they can see multiple companies, and they can drill down to those companies and see,
it's okay. It will be in the roadmap. Again, at the moment we have MSSP selling a product, but they just install an on-prem. They install on-prem within each customer's environment.
Okay, and then Chris wants to know, is it difficult to limit the AD sync to what's required?
So it varies, okay? I know that the default is to sync everything. And I know I think it's possible, but it's not an out-of-the-box functionality.
No, I would agree with that as well. Pedro wants to know, can you accommodate IoT?
As long as the IoT authenticate, if the IoT entities are accounts within Active Directory or any other directory, so yes.
All right, and then I think I have time for one more here. Let's see, Maurice says, for the admins with SPN, what about a situation where you can add an SPN to an account? I think this goes back to a conversation you had previously.
What is a situation where you can add an SPN to an account?
Yes.
Oh, I mean, you can add an SPN at will. I mean, that's
yeah.
That's true, but adding that it will just, if it's not necessary, it will just make it less secure.
Yeah. All right. So it looks like we're at the bottom of the hour. I think there might be a couple questions I might have missed. If we did, someone from Silverfort reach out to you to make sure you get your question answered. Do want to thank the folks at Silverfort for sponsoring today's real training for free. Yiftach, always a pleasure. I love hearing you talk, and it's nice to hear somebody who's technical and understands, what's actually going on under the hood, and at the same time, can actually really tell an entire story that keeps everybody engaged and see it as being valuable. So thanks a lot for being here today.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thanks everyone for attending. This is going to go ahead and conclude today's Real Training for Free webcast. Appreciate you attending today. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you on the next one.